This is the fourth video concerned with sustainability and my critique of sustainability. Now I found out that sustainability is an ideology, and it is established at universities, and I have claimed that it's not for universities to teach for sustainability, but about sustainability. But being in the subject of business administration, I can also ask the question, well, is my subject, business administration, free from ideological elements? Is sustainability the first ideological element? Of course it is not, and I will hear now through some anecdotes of my subject show that yes, we are teaching ideology in business administration. So let's continue. It is hard to be free from ideology, that is, to be free from concepts and theories that contains values, normative statements, and or support one of the groups of society, typically through legitimizing them and their actions. This is maybe especially true in the science of economics. I will touch anecdotally upon some of the contents of business administration to find elements of ideologies. These elements consist of the very definition of economics, some of the models of the corporation we have, the capital budgeting idea of net present value, financial accounting, and last but not the least, the suspicion that we in economics, we raise and train students to become egoists. Economics is the science of the production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services. Very often it is added in the definition that resources are scarce, which implies that choices have to be made considering the scarcity. Thus, economics can be regarded to some extent as being a science of choices under limitation of scarce resources. Then the normative, and that is the ideological content, enter into the science by the question, given the scarce resources, what production, what distribution, and what consumption produce the best outcome, the highest value? For whom? That question is often at the center of economics, subsumed under the concept of economizing. But both resources and the special value contains interest. For the worker, her and his body is a resource. For the employer that hires the worker, the body is not the resource of interest, but the individual's productive capacity. Thus, there exist factory environments that destroy the body resource of the employees, since the economizing behavior of the employee do not consider the body, since that is not priced. Only the service the worker can give has a price, not the body, because we don't have slavery. Highest value is also ideological, since we have to ask who defines what the relevant value is. In business administration as a subject, we have developed ideas of the corporation, how it is working and for what purpose. While being loaded with empirical observations, they have turned into idle types of corporations that slowly turns into ideologies by forgetting that they maybe started their lives as ideas with some empirical proof about the functioning of the corporation, but has over time turned into normative ideas of how a corporation should function. While one can find many such perspectives that can be turned into ideologies that is claimed to be the truth and the wanted order of business, I believe that the most established ones, at least in teaching, but also in many research streams, are managerialism, corporatism, shareholderism, and stakeholderism. Managerialism, that is, where managers and their interests are governing the corporation. It was claimed by Burnham, Galbraith to guide the American corporations. There is a difference in teaching students that managers have been found to have operational responsibility of an organization, to tell them that managers have and should have operational responsibilities of organizations. The practice of our societies has been converted from a description of practice, but partly also of legislation, to become a norm of practice. That is, it has become praxis. It is hard to find a causal link. What came first and what influenced what? Is it the causal chain managerialism in practice? Give scientific description of managerialism in practice? Give legitimization of managerialism? Become the natural practice, that is, praxis, the norm of managerialism. And then the reproduction of this ideology. Whatever. The other model, corporatism, which should not be confused with corporativism, by which I here mean that the corporation is a self-serving organization with the goal of survival. It can be found in the stewardship theory, where the board of directors and the top management team acts for the survival of the corporation as such. It can also be found in institutional theory, where institutions are directed the corporation. And it can be said to be inherent in the basic assumption of the going concern assumption in financial accounting. But it is a description of a practice. It is not a norm of how a corporation should work. Shareholder orientation, especially appearing in the subject of finance, where the shareholders are identified as the group of actors that the corporation has a goal to support, through maximization of the wealth of the shareholders. Here we teach that optimization of shareholder value should be performed. Should be. That is, it is a goal that is not questioned or discussed, but assumed as a matter of fact, as a natural fact. With this optimization, the other stakeholders' interest, including nature and social peace, becomes reduced to limitations. Of course, that is an ideology statement, because it's not a matter of fact. It exists somewhere in reality, but there also exist other statements of what is the basic stakeholder of the firm. Stakeholder orientation, as in the stakeholder model, is when management is a balancing entity that balances all stakeholders and their interests. In this model, sustainability enters since one stakeholder is the future generation. The problem with this is that the voice of the future generation cannot be heard since it does not exist. All these perspectives are presented in good teaching and in good research as different views, even as ideal types, which we can use in order to both organize data, that is to describe reality, and to explain reality. But the heavy yoke rests on the shoulders of us, the academics, to know these different perspectives, consider them all, and consider them as ideal types. If we give up the diversity and focus solely on one, that we present as being the model of the corporation, and even worse, if we claim that the purpose of the corporation in the model is, should be, and have to be the purpose of the corporation in reality, then we have turned ourselves into academic activists that support and promote an ideology, quite opposing the soul of academia and university. Thus, the perspectives as such do not represent ideology, but our use of them turn ideological if we convert them from being ideal types to become ontological. In economics, more specific in capital budgeting, we have the idea of net present value, claiming that money, or rather that resources, have higher value today than resources tomorrow. Why is that? Of course, there is risk, inflation, opportunity costs. But the family having some potatoes knows that if they starve a little bit today and put some of the potatoes in the soil, they will eventually end up with many more potatoes in the future. Thus, the potato today have less value today for eating than it will have in the future when it has become many more potatoes. So the potato as such has a low value today, but as an investment, a sacrifice, it has no value today, but a huge value tomorrow. This, well, not a perfect example, indicates that maybe does net present value give less investment than it could if we saw the value of the future. This tendency to reduce the value of the future does also imply that if we do something today that will have large costs in the future, for example, large environmental costs, these large costs do not appear as large for us today, since we consider them through our discounting eyeglasses, which do not enlarge the costs, but on the contrary, the thinking of net present values reduce the cost. So net present value perspective tends to decrease the value of the future and increase the value of today. Thus, it appears to contain a norm which is an ideological content. Net present value is carpe diem. It is used for investment analysis, but is an idea for a hedonistic society where tomorrow is another day. I think that we really need to consider the implications of net present value and its capacity to maybe hinder us from considering the future, which is the place where our kids and their kids will live. Accounting is a subject within business administration with two orientations. One is the positive accounting, where we try to explain or understand why corporations report in a certain way. The larger part of the accounting subject, especially in teaching, is the normative accounting theory telling us how economic entities should report in order to behave in accordance with an established logic system. This normative or orientation of accounting is overall an ideological instrument supporting the interest of the owner of the organization. Normative accounting can be criticized for its one-sided view, focusing on the interest of the owner of the entity, noticing the resource changes that ultimately affect the owner. As a reaction to this Pacioli system, this owner orientation, social accounting appeared and became very important, at least in Sweden in the 70s. But with the market orientation increasing in the 80s, it was reduced to some lines in the accounting report. Today, sustainability reporting has become even more important compared to what social reporting was. And we, the universities, have some courses in this. We have the courses because the students need to know about modern accounting reports, but also to balance the ordinary teaching in normative accounting. That is, to reduce the one-sidedness, the focus on the owner's interest. By this, both the teaching and the research is less one-sided, more critical, and therefore run less risk of ideology reproduction. Some have claimed that teaching in economics and in business administration fosters students to egoism. The dominating paradigm of economics assumes self-interest as the motivator in the economy. The dominating theory in many organizational studies is agency theory, which also assumes self-interest. Thus, it is claimed teaching in business schools promote the ideology and behavior of egoism. That is maybe or probably not correct. I have done one study of Swedish students in business administration where we could not find an increase in moral orientation during the 3-year program that could be interpreted as egoism. I have done a comparative study of students in Kharkiv, Ukraine, comparing business students with students in language, where we found indication of the humanist students to have higher moral orientation towards egoism. Quite the contrary, as expected. Recently, I gained Italian data using the same instrument as is in the published studies that do not indicate a higher egoistic orientation as a result of education among business students compared to students from humanistic studies. While one has to be very humble when doing studies of moral orientation, because it's so hard to study, the three studies indicate that it is probably not true that business programs push students in an egoistic orientation. It could very well be the case that business programs promote some ideologies and influence students to a certain Weltanschauung, that is of a worldview, but at least there is no strong indication that the business teacher influenced the student's moral orientation towards egoism. With these anecdotal examples, mainly from my part of business administration, accounting and finance, it is hard to escape the impression that our subject indeed contains elements of ideology, and even more, that we have opportunities of ideology for one-sidedness and lack of critique. But this impression does not give us the right to teach and conduct studies of sustainability as an ideology. Instead, it puts even harder demand on us to be aware of the ideological elements and to, if not possible to avoid them, at least present them as ideological elements. So, that was the conclusion. Now to the next video.